Hello, everyone. And Taylor is muted. And now
Oh,
Taylor's not muted. Okay. Hello, everyone. Uh, my name is Janet Herron, and I am an Alumni Engagement Officer at Memorial and your host for today's event. And we hope you're all well and safe as we begin to see some light at this end of a long pandemic tunnel. I'm here with Taylor Stocks, a PhD candidate at Memorial University. I know those of you who are attending can't see who else is in the room for the event, but we have a full house, over 290 registrants, and right now we have over 120 people on the meeting, and there are more joining every second. So we are all delighted about that. As always, we will begin today's event with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the lands on which Memorial University's campuses are situated are in the traditional territories of diverse Indigenous groups, and we acknowledge with respect the histories and cultures of the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, Innu, and Inuit of this province. We encourage everyone to reflect on these lands from where you are located and the Indigenous peoples for whom these lands are traditional territory. Now, today's event is brought to us and is being generally supported by Fortis. So there is a fantastic slide from Fortis that you can all see, and I'm going to keep that up for 1 second as I tell you that at the Office of Alumni Engagement, we are focused on many ways for you to connect with Memorial from anywhere in the world, and we're working diligently to create opportunities to celebrate, socialize, mentor, learn, and advance both your career and improve your life. Embarking on new and exciting ways to build relationships within our Memorial family of over 100,000 members is vital to our evolution as an institution. Our alumni and friends are advancing the reputation of our university, our province, and our world. Please consider getting involved with our programming. There are mentoring opportunities with 10,000 coffees, opportunities to meet up with Newfoundland and Labrador expats through Global NL, and we have an online book club called Coastlines, which features Newfoundland and Labrador authors who are also Memorial alumni. And you can find more details about these initiatives on our website, www.mun.ca/alumni. Thank you for joining us today for our discussion about gender equity, where we are going to learn the basics about how to be inclusive of trans persons, including respectful language, pronouns, histories, and current issues. Just a few housekeeping things to mention. We will be having a brief Q&A following Taylor's presentation. My colleague Andrea Warman and I will be monitoring the Q&A function, which you will find at the bottom right of your screen. So please post your questions in there. Keep them short and post them as soon as possible. Don't leave them to the last minute, as we have a very full program. We have a lot of attendees, and I predict that we are going to have a lot of questions for Taylor, and we only have a limited time. Audience members are unable to unmute your microphone or turn on your video, so posting questions in the chat or the Q&A is the only way to ask a question. We are streaming live, but we are recording this session, and you will receive a link to the event in a follow-up email. Now, it is my great pleasure. I'm going to just pop up Taylor's presentation. So that's up there, and there we have it. And I'm going to just give Taylor the controls as well while I introduce them. Okay. It is my very great pleasure to introduce our special guest today, Taylor Stocks. Taylor is a trans disabled activist and educator who made Newfoundland their home almost 10 years ago. Initially moving here to complete their M.Phil in institutional decision-making, they quickly became involved in queer organizing through St. John's Pride and the Trans Needs Committee. Over the past 8 years, they have delivered dozens of gender equity workshops to schools, governments, nonprofit organizations, and corporate clients. Now, Taylor is completing his PhD in the Faculty of Education, looking at intersections between queer student activism and equity policy in K-12 schooling. In their spare time, Taylor performs as drag king Dr. Androbox and will be releasing his debut album of drag music when life and time allow. I now will turn the presentation over to Taylor, and I'm going to mute myself and turn off my video.
Thanks so much, Janet, and thank you everyone for being here. It's so exciting to see over 150 of you taking the time today to learn about trans identities and gender equity and what you can do to make sure that the spaces that you hold are safe and inclusive for trans and gender nonconforming folks. So, what are we going to get into today? I've got a pretty full presentation. I've got a lot of information on these slides, and I'm not actually going to touch on all of it, but you will be sent out this presentation after, along with the actual video link. So I encourage you to take a look at whatever kind of piques your interest as I move through things. So who am I? Taylor Stocks. I am a fourth-year PhD candidate studying with Dr. Gerald Galway, Dr. Joelle Rodway, and Dr. Christine Arnold in the Faculty of Education. And I currently sit on MUN's Equity and Employment Equity and Diversity Advisory Committee, and I'm the former chair of the St. John's Inclusion Advisory Committee. So really here for equity in all sorts of intersections that, that we can find when we work together as a community. Today, I'm going to talk to you about some of the language that we can use in terms of the terms and how to navigate pronouns. I will touch on identities and histories of transgender folks, as well as recent developments and some current issues. And then I'll finish with how you can support gender equity within your own spaces and in yourself. I encourage you to ask your questions within the chat, and I will have a couple of opportunities where if you do have, a burning term or burning question in relation to something that's on the slide, that I'll pause and ask there. So let's get right into it because we don't have a ton of time today. So some of the, I like to use comics. The comics that I use most often are drawn by Sophie Labelle, who's a trans woman from Montreal. She does assigned male comics and candy core comics, which I'd suggest you check out if you want kind of good digestible pieces that can help you understand trans community and trans issues as they happen today. So let's start with some of the basics. Sorry. Sex, sexuality, and gender. Oftentimes when we're worried about, say, sexualizing kids when we talk about gender, it's because we aren't actually understanding the clear differences between these three terms. So sex is generally assigned at birth based on external sex characteristics. It is typically binary, male or female gets put on a birth certificate. And we do often make correlations with chromosomes or hormones, even though we don't necessarily test for these. So intersex folks who generally show external sex characteristics of being in between exist, as well as intersex people whose chromosomes or whose hormone alignment doesn't quite match what we would expect. Sexuality, of course, is who you're attracted to. And it can often align with sex or gender of another person. That's typically how we speak about it. But it can be broken down into multiple categories. So we can talk about sexual attraction, we can talk about romantic attraction, we can talk about being intimate, and all of these things sort of play into the dynamic of sexuality. So one of the shortcuts that I take is if sexuality is who you want to go to bed with, gender is who you go to bed as. It's kind of who you live your life as. And this is your internal feeling of who you are, whether it's being a man or a woman or being non-binary or not really having a gender at all. This is why we often say that sex and gender are different, because we recognize that sex is assigned from the outside, typically from doctors, whereas gender really is more that internal sense of when you quiet everything else and you listen to your body and your brain in terms of what it's telling you about who you are. That's where gender is coming from there. Let's keep going. So you've probably seen a very long acronym in different varieties to describe folks. It could be LGBTQIA+, could be 2S LGBTQ+. Lots of folks ask me, well, why do we need such a long acronym? And my response is often, well, it's more about the folks who find identification within it than it is about, cramming a bunch of letters into your face. So Most commonly, I see this is probably one of the longest ones that is used. One thing that I want to note is that A does not stand for ally. Sorry, folks, really appreciate you all being here today, but you don't get an acronym. This is really in terms of the different genders and sexualities that are most commonly found. There are probably dozens, perhaps hundreds of other terms that are used, and especially coming out from queer and trans youth. Really exciting for me, kind of a headache for some of us who are trying to do research on it and nail down some of that language. But I think one of the beauties of the queer community is the fluidity of language that can come of that. So let's talk about a few more terms on this page here. So you might see the acronym AFAB or AMAB. This means either assigned male or assigned female at birth. And this is an important term for a couple of reasons. So one, it recognizes that sex is assigned, right? It's given to you by a doctor. It's not just, you don't get to choose, obviously, when you're born, what sex is being put on your documentation. It also gets around terms like born a man or born female, or terms that would imply that a person isn't trans sort of when they come out, right? Like I was always non-binary and trans, I just didn't know it for 23 years. So for me, assigned female at birth is a nice way of saying, well, yeah, these are my experiences sort of up until my transition and still color my experiences as a trans person. Probably have heard the term transgender, especially if you're appearing here today. The opposite of trans is cisgender. Not a slur, it simply means that your gender aligns with the sex that you're assigned at birth. Cis and trans actually come from chemistry. The chemistry terms meaning cis on the same side as, or trans on the other side. Again, this is trying to get away from normal people and trans people. So cisgender and transgender. And yes, we can talk about these in binary, but as queer people do, we can complicate that and recognize that there's a lot of messy ground sort of on the line between trans and cis, especially when we're talking about non-binary folks. There's some non-binary people like me who do identify as transgender because I don't identify as the sex that I was assigned at birth. There's some non-binary people who don't identify as trans because they're kind of okay with their sex assigned at birth, but they have a different relationship to it. So really, non-binary is actually a large umbrella term that can sort of capture a whole lot of other identities, trans identities and gender non-conforming identities that sit outside of the gender binary of man and woman. A note on two-spirit. I am very white. I am very much a settler. I am currently on Algonquin and Anishinaabe land here in Ottawa, Ontario. And two-spirit is not for my use. It is a term for Indigenous folks that's loosely related to someone's spirit, gender, and sexuality. So even if I might feel like I have two spirits inside of me, two-spirit is not my term to use. And there are lots of other terms, as is shown in just even the short list here. One other term that I want to talk about before moving on is the term queer. You'll hear me using it a lot, and for some people, especially those who are unfamiliar with our community or who are coming into or from older generations where this word might have been used as a slur more often, it can be a little off-putting, or you might wonder if it's offensive to use the word queer. So I use it as an identification of both my sexuality and gender, but also to talk about the political leanings that I have and the community that I connect to. Often people who identify as queer are looking for other people who, are trying to mobilize that queerness in other aspects of their lives. So of course, use terminology that folks are choosing for themselves. That's kind of rule number one. If you know how a person wants to refer to themselves, then use that first. Secondly, the alphabet soup is nice if you don't really know what terms people are using. And then as well, if you want to talk about the queer community, because we are a community and we do use queer to define us as a community, that's generally okay. So I'm just going to pause right now, take a sip of water, and ask if there are any other terms that you've heard of, that you're wondering, that you want me to touch on now before I move on to the next part of the presentation. You can either put them in the Q&A or in the chat. I'll see either of those. All right, I'm not seeing anything yet. But feel free to put any other terms that you might want to know about within the chat or the Q&A, and I can always come back to them at the end of the day. Another thing that will be sent out along with the presentation is a resource guide, and that includes the 519 Media Guide, which I think is one of the best and most extensive lists that exist out there. Oh, good. A few more coming in now. All right. So when referring to gay, is that acceptable for lesbians also? Many of the women that I know who identify as lesbians would also call themselves gay women. When we do talk about gay culture, I think that's when we have to be a little bit more careful, because gay male culture can occasionally be more visible, more prevalent within our community. So that's the condition that I'd be careful with under, but generally to say gay woman is, as far as I can tell, quite acceptable. Gender fluid, cool. So you're actually picking up on my identity here. Gender fluid tends to sit under that non-binary umbrella, either trans or not trans. Again, some gender fluid people identify as trans and some not. It's generally the experience of your gender changing. Kind of sounds a bit odd. It took me a really long time to feel like I wasn't a little odd or mad because of it. And one of the gender identities that's taken the least seriously. So I'm actually quite protective about who I tell sometimes. But I wake up feeling like a different gender than I did yesterday. So some days I might wake up and I feel very much like a trans man, and I only want to be called he, and I bind and I make sure that my appearance is as masculine as possible. Whereas other days I have no feeling of gender at all, and I kind of sit on the outside of things, and neither man or woman really makes sense to me. And so it's this feeling of movement through gender or multiple gender experiences that is fairly typical of gender fluid folks. Asexual means that you don't experience sexual attraction. It's not necessarily through trauma or any other particular reason. It's just kind of not there. Asexual people might still engage in sexual practices because, for a lot of reasons, whether it's to feel close to a partner or because, you know, physical sensation can be okay even if it's not really connected to like a sexual experience. Lots of different kinds of asexuality out there, but at its basis, just like agender is the lack of feeling any gender, asexual is the lack of feeling sexuality. Okay, I've heard people say that they're part of the LGBTQIA2S plus community or queer community because they are an ally. What do I think about this? I like to call folks like this queer adjacent. I don't think that you're actually part of the queer community necessarily or within that alphabet, right? Like the A doesn't stand for ally, but I have a lot of straight friends, straight cisgender friends who know the language, who get our jokes, who are really supportive, really inclusive, and they're kind of everything queer except actually being queer. So my term that I've come up for these folks is queer adjacent, in that you are close enough to our community to really understand and participate in it, without actually saying that, like, as an ally, I am part of the queer community. Salutations. Would MX replace Mr. and Mrs.? Yes, that is. It's pronounced mix, MX, period. I'm half getting my doctorate, so I never have to check off a Mr. and Mrs. box ever again. It'll just be Dr. Stocks, and nobody can say boo. Are there any terms that are commonly thought to be offensive by outside the community but actually are? That's a great question. I'm going to pause and think about that, and I might return to that question as a text response when the other documents are sent out. There, of course, are lots of slurs. I don't generally include them here. The 519 guide does, so I'd check that out. My understanding is that Q is for queer or questioning. That's right. Queer, Q typically for queer, but questioning always is kind of an accepted part, right? Like you can't really be a part of the queer community unless you ask yourself that question to begin with. And that's where you start to see the blurring of the lines between queer community and not queer community, right? Because a lot of the queer adjacent folks sometimes then end up start questioning and then coming in. I looked like a straight woman for a really long time. So it's really important not to kind of judge people based on what they look like in terms of the participation in the queer community. Okay. Agender. Okay, so I think I covered that. So agender is the lack of experience of feeling like you have a gender. So it's like, nope, not a man, not a woman, not non-binary, don't really get this whole gender thing in the first place. I've got a feeling that a bunch of cisgender folks out there might find resonance with the term agender. That's just a theory of mine. And then intersex is talking, instead of gender up here, talking sort of back down to the sex level. That's talking about chromosomes, hormones, or physical characteristics that don't fit clearly within the male or female binary. Is it acceptable to use LGBTQ+, or is it best to use the acronym that I have? The one I'm actually using right now in my PhD is 2S LGBTQ+, but the Canadian Centre for Sexuality, for Gender Diversity and Gender and Sexual Diversity offered 2S LGBTQIA+ as their standard term. So that's where the language is kind of sitting right now, but these things are in flux, so there's no sort of best way of getting the alphabet, unfortunately. I imagine that in 2 years, when I go to actually submit my dissertation, I will have to redo all the alphabets and even some of the terminology that I've used. Okay, I'm going to take these 2 more questions and then I'm going to move on because we're 15 minutes in and I got a ways to go through here. What is meant by pansexual? Attraction to anyone. Doesn't matter the gender. That's the short of it. Are non-binary and agender interchangeable? Not necessarily. Some agender people probably, like if agent, sort of, sorry, that's not clear at all. I'm non-binary and sometimes I have an experience of no gender, so it would fit under there, but not all agender people are non-binary, not all non-binary people are agender. So I'd keep them sort of separate, but some people might use them together to describe what they experience. Okay, last one, quilt bag. I have heard of it. I like the term gender and sexual minority as a nice kind of catch-all. And Gender and Sexuality Alliance, GSA, coming from the Gay Straight Alliance, using that same acronym. But quilt bag's cool. I haven't seen it picked up in the same ways though. Okay, I'm gonna keep on going. Let's talk about pronouns for a second. Pronouns are not a preference. So here's not something that's offensive, but I do get a little bit annoyed when folks ask for my preferred pronouns because they're not preferred. I am a they or a he. If you use she, you're just getting it wrong, right? It's not a preference. Preferences can be ignored. So when you're asking what someone's pronouns are, try to leave out that word preference. It is about respect, but it really takes work to adapt to new pronouns. And this is because of how language works in our brains. So if you think about language kind of in the conscious aspects and the unconscious ones. So when you're learning a new language, you're thinking about every single word that has to come in that sentence. But when you're speaking your first language, you're usually just thinking about core concepts, and a bunch of the other words sort of fill themselves in around it so that we can speak and think quite quickly. Pronouns live in this unconscious part. So what we're doing when we're changing pronouns is first we actually have to recognize that we're using them, which is tougher than you think, drag them into our conscience, switch them to the correct one, and then try and shove them back into our subconscious. So it's really great that you can care about pronouns, but unless you're willing to do the work and to develop the skills and get your mouth and brain trained, it's just not going to work. Some of the ways you can integrate pronoun checks in meetings. I had a lab where we would do a pronoun check every meeting, even though we had the same group of people sitting around the table once a week, in recognition that like pronouns can change. And for me as a trans person, it was actually really helpful to be able to try out some new pronouns and names within those spaces because it felt really quite safe. That's an anomaly. Max Lebron's Clear lab, 2 thumbs up to them. Pronouns and email signatures, I'm seeing a lot more of this these days. That's great to know, and often will cue me. Pronouns on name badges, or in here, you know, I really like Zoom now. They've integrated pronouns there. Phrases that you can use to ask about pronouns are just, can you tell me what pronouns you use? This is not an offensive question unless you use it in an offensive way. If there's a room full of people and one of them looks kind of like you can't tell what their gender is, and you go out over to them and ask what their pronouns are and don't ask anyone else, that can feel like being singled out in a problem. Ask everyone what their pronouns are. That's great. If you're introducing yourself, you can also just introduce your own pronouns. So, hi, my name's Taylor. I use they and them pronouns. Who are you? What's your name? What are your pronouns? One of my favorite slyest tactics used by a best friend of mine to this day, who I met and interacted with like probably 3 or 4 hours with in public before we ever got a chance to speak privately. He came to me and he said, well, I've been using she pronouns for you, but I just wanted to make sure that that's correct. And that just warmed the cockles of my heart. It was lovely. Um, so if ever you need, and I use this with my friends too, it's like, hey, I just want to check in with your pronouns. Just want to make sure which ones I've got. Now, frankly, I've got a lot of trans and queer friends, so this is very normal in our groups, but I think that that shows it can be normal if it needs to be. One thing not to do, the pronouns she uses are he or they. That indicates to me that you have not done the work to actually change your understanding of my gender experience and who I am. And you're just sort of dangling the language where it's easy. People will often ask me, well, they, but isn't it plural? Goodness, isn't there another pronoun that we can use? Yes, there is. Z and here. Taylor went to the store with your mother and Z picked up some milk for yourself. I found that it's way more difficult for people to integrate this most common pronoun, because there are a whole bunch of gender neutral ones that have been developed by our community, than it is to integrate they and them. For the grammarians in the room, they, the singular they is older than the singular you. And it only became grammatically incorrect in the Victorian era, where, funnily enough, there's a lot of repression of gender and sexuality too. Huh, wonder if there's a correlation there. I don't know. Sometimes I get questions about it. There are a very, very small handful of people who use this, often, wanting to disrupt understandings of gender, but typically don't, ever refer to a person as an it, because it's an object, not a subject or a person. So we're all going to make mistakes. I make mistakes all the time. I have trans friends now, and I still get their pronouns wrong. And that's okay, because we are learning and because language is hard. So I offer you 3 steps to gracefully move on when you inevitably will make a mistake. Pause, recognize the fact that you used a pronoun first, try again, correct your sentence, and then just keep going. So start your sentence again, just with the correct pronoun. Oh, Taylor went to the store with her mom and she picked up some pants. Taylor went to the store with their mom and they picked up some really cool pants and they were telling me this about them, right? When you're alone or with someone else, you can, for every time you get it wrong, practice it 3 times right over. And mistakes are fine as long as you're correcting them as you go, and as long as you have that sort of longer term trend toward learning, right? I don't mind if someone gets my pronouns incorrect. Firstly, if they catch themselves and correct themselves right off the bat. And secondly, if I can see that sort of slow development of learning. If someone is still misgendering me a year or 2 later after meeting me and working with me, that's when I start to get really exhausted and it's really difficult. Things not to do when you make a mistake with pronouns. Apologize. You will probably want to apologize. We are very Canadian. Sorry will come out of our face the first before anything else. But what happens when you apologize is that I have 2 options. One is the one I use most often, which is say, oh, it's okay, because I don't want to make a big deal about my pronouns. I hate correcting my pronouns. I've been out for 8 years and I still have a lot of difficulty correcting people when they misuse my pronoun. So I have to tell you that it's okay when it's, kind of not. Or I have to interrupt the conversation and say why it's not okay. So if you apologize, you're sort of looking for the other person to fix it and to make it better. So just skip the apology and move straight on. The other thing to really avoid is to explain why it's difficult for you to use the correct pronouns. I guarantee you all trans people know why it's difficult. I have heard every reason under the sun. But if my best friends of 25 years who have known me since I was a wee she can upgrade their pronouns and understanding of my gender, then so can everybody, especially who meets me here, because none of y'all knew me before I was trans or came out as trans. Okay. Any questions on specifically around how to correct pronouns before I move on to the next section? Okay, hopefully that's nice and clear. At the end of the day, this is a Band-Aid solution while you get your brain in gear to actually change how you're perceiving someone's gender, right? Language is just the kind of the tip of the iceberg here, and this is a nice sort of short-term way to correct as you readjust and realign your understandings and expectations of the person you're talking to. Okay, let's talk about trans identities. There are lots. You can come out when you're young, you can come out when you're old. It doesn't make you any less valid. It's often when we have the safety and language and context to recognize the transness in ourselves that, we actually can come out. For me, I went to an all-girls school for 13 years. I'm surprised I realized that I wasn't a girl at the ripe young age of 23, frankly, because it never occurred to me that I could go to an all-girls school and not be a girl. That's all right. There are binary and non-binary trans people, as I've said. And transition will often include social and or medical components. You do not need to transition to be trans. It is not a requirement of being trans to transition. Many people do not transition for a whole variety of reasons, whether it's safety, expectations of the people around them, or just comfort kind of in the way that they've crafted their life, and that's totally okay. Social transition will often include finding the right pronouns that fit and the right name that really, resonates, adjusting external appearance. So for me, cutting my hair off, dressing more masculinely, and using gender supportive gear for trans men that might be binders or packers. For trans feminine folks could be gaffs or bras or other ways of shifting the body sort of temporarily so that it can be better read by the society around. There's also medical transition. There's a lot of worry and concern these days about kids transitioning too young, which, if you know the science behind it, really just means that they're getting puberty blockers. So this basically just delays hormonal puberty that is built into whatever chromosomes that you've got built in your body. So a lot of difficulty for trans folks is that their body will develop in ways that don't align with who and how they are. And that can be really scary. So puberty blockers just sort of give a time window, between 12 and 18 or 16, whenever, actual consent, often, in line with the parents and other supportive systems can be made. There have been no signs of harmful implications of using puberty blockers. We are not giving young kids testosterone or hacking off their bits. Like, it just doesn't happen. So a lot of the hysteria that's out there is really based on a number of myths that are just frankly not true. For older folks above the age of 18 or 16 with parental consent, that's when you might be looking at hormone replacement therapy or gender confirmation surgeries. You might often hear the terms top surgery or bottom surgery. These broad terms will often refer to quite a number of surgeries sort of within those fields. And these are covered spottily through Canada. Newfoundland is particularly interesting because I believe at the moment, you can get top surgery covered, but not necessarily nipple reattachment, which is like, okay, cool, but people want nipples generally. So that's why, calling it top surgery can be useful colloquially, but less useful if you're actually dealing with the legalities or more medical aspects. Questions not to ask. Did you have the surgery? First of all, it's not the surgery, as I say. Second of all, why are you asking about someone's medical history, right? Why aren't you on hormones? What's your real name? Folks often ask me, because I've got a very gender neutral name, if that was a gift from my parents or I chose it for myself. You don't actually really need to know that information because Taylor is the name that I go by. Another thing to avoid is introducing me based on my transness. This is my trans friend Taylor. They exist in their transness. I guarantee you my transness is not the most interesting thing about me. If you're going to introduce me, at least call me a drag king, because that's the thing that I choose to be. All right. There's this idea that we're new because we're visible and because people are showing up to events like this. When I started running these workshops, I'd get maybe 10 to 15 people. There are 181 people currently sitting and listening to the words coming out of my face, which blows my mind. So I would like to remind you all that we have existed forever. Two-spirit is actually an umbrella term that describes a number of different identities found within different Indigenous cultures to describe folks who don't fit within that binary. Hijra people in India or in South Asia are recognized as a third gender. There's lots of examples of trans and gender non-conforming people through the ages. We have always been here. And our activism has been here too. We often know a lot more about the States and what's going on there, and we forget that Canadian queer history, we have a good history of activism here too. So we demand gays and lesbians at the time, because that was the terminology that was used, marched to Parliament Hill with a list of 10 demands, including, right to spousal support and to have kids and to have all the legal protections here within Canada in 1971. And we just celebrated the 50-year anniversary of that this year. Trans Pride marches started in Canada fairly recently, just over a decade ago. Toronto had its first one. I believe the first trans march in Newfoundland was in 2012. And usually these trans marches are separate from more corporate pride events. And I really appreciate the grassroots organizing aspect of the trans march there. So we've existed, we've always existed, and we will continue to exist. Gender identity and expression are now covered under the Canadian Human Rights Act and all provincial human rights codes. That's great. We like our legal protections. One of the more ridiculous things for me was APA, which is a citational practice. Now recognizing they as an acceptable third person singular pronoun. That only happened 2 years ago. I started my degree in 2018. So for the first year, any paper that I wrote, I would have to write a disclaimer at the top explaining why I was using the they pronoun, even though it was against citational rules. Thank you for asking me to justify my existence, APA. And then we've also seen sort of a rise of supportive organizations. So the Quadrangle is a queer community center in Newfoundland trying to get a building, finally got charity status. Check out their work because they're offering quite a bit of programming now. But also we have the Trans Lifeline that's opening up in Canada. So we are seeing gradually more supports for trans and gender nonconforming folks across Canada here as well. But there's still a lot going on. So here's a 2016 study that is showing the realities of trans kids. Now, a lot of work has been done in the last 5 years. It would be great to see where these numbers are now. EGAL just released their report in July looking at homophobia and transphobia in schools, which is showing a decline in overall violence and harassment, but it still exists and is prevalent in lots of places. So safety is always an issue, especially for trans feminine people and especially for trans people of color. There is a lot of data showing that, the more sort of intersectional oppression that you experience, the less safe you are going to be as a trans person, the less you'll have access to healthcare or employment or access to community spaces. We have a lot of things that are still reinforcing this idea that assigned female people are the only women, which I take offense to because I don't want to be called a woman just because I was assigned female at birth, and men. So still lots of stuff going on. I encourage you to be following some trans artists and activists if you want to kind of keep up to date on how the stuff progresses, especially some of the laws coming out of the States that are really harmful to trans kids, like the bathroom bills and sports bills. Okay, I'm going to pause for a question here. Why an option for a third gender on a birth certificate if gender is how you feel, which you won't know as a baby? Thinking it is mixing up gender and sex. Yes. So while we separate these two categories out, there is quite a bit of blurring that goes on. So you might have a third sex designation on a birth certificate for intersex folks. My background is not in intersex activism, so I would leave that to the intersex community to determine how that might look or work. And then I guess there's the option too of like, well, if you just don't know what the gender is, you can put an X in as a placeholder and get it changed later, right? Like that's essentially what the Newfoundland government is asking trans people to do, which is to go back and change their birth certificate, which is then the only way you can get the other documents to reflect your gender. Unlike Ontario, say, where you can get your driver's license with an X on it without changing any other kind of documentation. So the ways that people are getting documentation is also starting to shift as well. There are quite a few differences between the provinces that determine your access to institutional legitimacy, frankly. Okay, so I've been talking to you a lot. I've got 2 more things to get through, and then we will open it up to questions because we're running out of time. So lots of folks, okay, you know you know stuff. You're going to do your reading. You're going to follow a couple of trans people on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter to keep up to date on what's on the go. Here's some other stuff that you can do. So, do you ask for someone's name and pronoun? The more that this is normalized by not trans people, the easier and safer it will be for trans people to participate in spaces. For me, you can probably tell by my high-pitched voice, I am not on hormone replacement therapy and will be misgendered for the rest of my life because of this. So the more that I see someone asking for names and pronouns in the context that I'm in, the more comfortable I will be to say, oh, actually, I'm not quite who you think I am. I know you think I look like, I don't know, maybe a gay woman. That's the thing that I get most often. But turns out that's not actually the case. You can ask for their name and pronoun, but you don't really need a lot of other information, right? One of the things I want to underscore is that respect and understanding are not the same thing, and you don't actually need to understand in order to be respectful. So avoid that. Do correct yourself when you make a mistake without overly apologizing or explaining. And ask generally if you can share if someone is trans, especially if they're early on within their transition, or you might not know their status, so that you don't out them accidentally. This could be for people who maybe pre-medical transition for different reasons as post-medical transition, who may be passing as the gender that they want to be and don't want people to know that they are trans. Do not out someone without their consent. You all have permission to talk to anyone you like about my trans existence. I am very public about my transness, and anybody who doesn't know, that's their problem. Do use in gender inclusive language. I hate the his/hers. I always joke that I'm the slash on washroom signs as well, when they have the like man body and the woman body and the slash. I'm like, oh yeah, there I am. That's back when I was really thin. Gender inclusive language is a nice way of making sure that everyone is included, even non-binary folks. And you don't need to be the grammar police when it comes to they and them. Do normalize pronoun checks at the beginning of meetings, but don't single the person out. I had this happen when I asked for a pronoun check from a boss once, and she did introductions of everyone in the room and then introduced me and introduced my pronouns, and it was super awkward and weird, and I felt like the token trans kid with the giant dunce hat on. Do ensure trans spaces are trans friendly and inclusive. It's really difficult to be invited to do a talk, say at a building that only has binary multi-stalled washrooms or doesn't necessarily have a safe way to get home at night. Public transit isn't always safe for gender nonconforming people, nor are taxis. And then of course, advocate for designs and processes that support all people. And sometimes things rub up against each other, right? So for instance, some trans people are like, oh, we can just have an all gender washroom, like whatever, it doesn't matter. But culturally speaking, some women cannot want to be around men when they are dealing with their private affairs. Some folks have like bad hijab days and need to adjust them in spaces that are free of men. So having inclusive conversations, recognizing that gender often gets conflated and transness gets conflated with whiteness, and queerness can be really white, it can be really able-bodied. So recognizing where there are those intersections to open up the conversations for contextual solutions that actually meet the needs of the people who are within that community. Okay, and then at work, you can ensure that your policies aren't accidentally discriminatory. There's a lot of this going on as well too, even like, I won't get into it too deeply because my background is policy and I love it. Do collect data on people's experiences, especially if you have some trans people coming into your office. I have never had an exit interview for any of the spaces that I've worked at, and I've had a lot to say about gender if anyone were to ask me, but they didn't. So there's that information lost. Look at your forms, look at your physical design. If you need to, hold a gender equity audit. You can host a session where, looking at stuff like this. I do work that specifically looks at particular offices and needs there. There are lots of other folks like me who do this kind of work who just really want to make workspaces safe and inclusive for everyone. So take advantage of the resources that are out there. You're already doing that by showing up to a free seminar. So congrats, everyone. In your community, follow and support artists, activists, and advocates. the people who are doing this work are the ones who are going to be most up to date on this information and can give you some really good on the ball stuff. I've been to a couple of these presentations that were run by cisgender straight folks, and some of their information is just a bit outdated, right? And I'm like, oh yeah, well, not quite. So do your best to sort of get your trans information from trans people as opposed to cis people who are sort of parroting what they have learned. And this way, you can dispel some of those myths and really question exclusionary practices that you see around you, be a good ally and advocate and show up when trans people are asking for it or when you see the opportunity. And pay attention to the diversity, especially if you're talking about gender equity and it's just about women. That's where, you might want to sort of put up your spidey sense and be like, hey, you know what, like gender actually expands beyond this man woman thing, and women and gender minorities often have a lot of good mutual space to work together on stuff. And then within yourself, because frankly, gender is something we start showing signs that we understand gender patterns at the age of 2. Gender is one of the most deeply embedded constructs that we have for understanding how humans work and setting expectations around each other. So exploring your own definitions of gender, and I use the word woman here, but woman or man, but woman tends to be much more fraught in conversations around trans identities. Just really start to open up what you think it means and why it means that, and when you get defensive and protective about stuff, and what that can say about where you are and how you understand gender. And then just practice your pronouns, practice this new language. Um, so hopefully, I know I've crammed a whole whack of information in 40 minutes here. Thank you for listening. This has been fantastic to have you all here. I hope some of these tips have been helpful. As I said, you will get the presentation, the recording, list of resources, and if there are any questions, and we will go a little bit past 2 today, so I can stick on for some extra questions. But if there are questions that I don't get to, I can type up some responses as well. Always feel free to email me as well. And thank you very much, everyone. I'll bring back Janet. It's going to be all shiny and excited and get you your questions.
Sorry.
That's good. I'm fine filling time. I got lots to say about everything.
Can you hear me? Okay, here I'm back. Thanks. Thank you, Taylor, so much for that amazingly informative and fascinating presentation. We have another sponsor today. I'm just going to mention Johnson Insurance. I can't find my slides, but Johnson Insurance offers Memorial University alumni specially designed policies and preferred rates on home, auto insurance, and travel insurance. So you can get more information on our website from that. We do have some questions, but you remember you can put in the chat or the Q&A. We have so many positive comments, so many people that had to leave early but said, please, I'm so looking forward to seeing the rest of that presentation. Darlene Evans says she loves those tips. Kim St. John said she found it very helpful. And we're going to go right to the questions because I know we've got so many. So we're not even gonna stop to pause here. We're going to dive right in. So Taylor, first off, how would an educator contact you to ask you about scheduling a presentation in a high school?
Those are my favorite presentations. I love working with schools. That's why my PhD is on queer student activism, especially in middle school and high schools. You can contact me at tstocks@mun.ca. Very happy to be working with anyone who is looking for support or presentations, or if you have a question that is like more personal and you don't want to ask it within a public forum, feel free to email me here, I'll type that in the chat there, tstocks@mun.ca. And I will give you all a heads up. I do manage a pretty severe form of ulcerative colitis and rheumatoid arthritis. So I may be slightly delayed in getting back to y'all, but it is not because I don't want to. It is because sometimes my hands don't work. So I appreciate your patience with getting in touch with me.
Here's a question. How would you change such descriptors as aunts and uncle, for example?
Oh, so this is where I hang out a lot in Facebook and Instagram are my two social media pods, especially Facebook for the support groups. So I'm in quite a number of like trans support groups and gender fluid and non-binary groups. And this is where folks will often just like crowdsource stuff because there's often not a great term. So for aunt and uncle, I like uncle, A-U, uncle. That's the term that I use for my friends' kids, which is fun. But a lot of the time we're just kind of like inventing words, and there isn't necessarily like the best practice of words, which is why someone like me, you know, I will say, oh, well, default to male nouns if there's no gender neutral option. Some people aren't like that. Some people really want that gender neutral one, or they're okay with feminine nouns. Really depends, but I think that's the cool part about like hanging out in these support groups is really seeing like people be creative and figure out like how they want to be referred to.
Exactly. Um, Here's a question. How do you feel about trans people in the Olympics?
Very contentious, definitely. Dane Woodland is another trans activist in Newfoundland who does work specifically around sports. And he's definitely more informed on this than I am. But I would like to point out that some of the ways that we are defining sex and gender in the Olympics are excluding cisgender women, typically Black cisgender women. So Caster Semenya, there's another woman whose natural testosterone levels were too high and they were disqualified from competing. So um, there are some biological realities about hormones that we just haven't quite figured out yet. The other thing is that the Olympics have been allowing transgender people to compete for like a decade. So a lot of the fears, right, around like, oh my God, the trans people are going to come in and dominate is like statistically and historically not true. So that's as far as I'll go on sharing my opinion, which is not to share my opinion, just to share some facts that I think can help ground that conversation going forward.
Fantastic. Um, is there what? Okay, well, here's someone's comment. Why do we record sex on birth certificates at all? Is it necessary for any good reason?
Um, so one of the reasons why we started recording um, or why we started distinguishing woman as a category was because humanism ended up being talking about men. And there's a lot of ramifications from that, even in the way that we like test drugs. Most drug testing is done on cisgender male bodies and then doesn't quite translate for women and other folks who might not quite fit within that norm. So I do think that there's still importance of defining woman and woman's spaces. Um, Now, whether or not we put that on a birth certificate, I'm not sure. I've just recently moved to Ontario. I was really surprised that my health card doesn't have uh, an M or an F on it at all. There's no space for sex designation at all, um, which is one of the places where most people would argue that you should have it because, oh, if you're taken in for a medical, they need to know what bits you have, which is generally not true unless you're operating on those bits and then you take off the clothes and find out anyway. And then even the M or the F can be misleading. So I'm not sure why it has to be on there other than it is important for us to count difference in bodies, I think, still. Um, but to do it in a way that's inclusive, I don't know if we've actually gotten there yet.
Is there a best way to approach someone before you've been introduced? For example, when you are referring to that person over there instead of that man slash woman slash lady over there, or excuse me, ma'am, or sir.
So this is a tough one, especially if you work in service, which I did for many years. The polite thing to do is often to stick a ma'am or a sir at the end of something, and unfortunately, there's not like the a best way of going about it. I tend to use the they them pronoun until I know what someone's actual pronouns are, um, and at the end of the day, statistically people are cisgender. So the likelihood of saying, oh, that man over there is likely, right? If you find out later that they're not a man and then you don't switch over, then yeah, you're not being very kind. But you know, there's there's a limit of reasonableness with our language in terms of communicating information, that I think is important to stick to, as well, and kind of frames the flexibility that we can functionally use within the course of our day-to-day conversation, especially with folks who are not who don't have English as their first language, because that's part of accessibility and inclusion as well.
We've got a couple of questions about appropriate signage for gender neutral washrooms, rather than that traditional, those traditional stick figures.
Stick a toilet on it. Just put what's inside, right? There's great graphics of just a toilet, and then you put a change table if there's one in there, and you can put, if there's good proper stalls, then you put put what is actually in the room on the door sign.
What a brilliant idea. Wow. Now
Yeah.
that is simple and brilliant. Would you add a pronoun section to a general intake or information form?
Yes, I would, and I
Yes, you
often do
would.
that for organizations, is to stick that on their intakes,
It's
as long as
definitely
people will pay attention to it, right? That's the one thing that I found about name badges at conferences. Remember when we used to go to those in person? Was that the pronouns would be on the name badge, but no one would ever look at them. So I'd still get cheat all the time, even though I had he on my badge. So that's the other thing too. If you're going to add stuff to forms, or like integrate it into other practices, you have to have the connecting other processes to make sure that that works, right? Your documents have to be alive in order for them to be respectful.
Absolutely. Um, and, someone's writing in, my organization supports the Canadian Forces and are in the process. Oh wait, this is the other bathroom shower question. Sorry. Someone in Nova Scotia saying, fantastic chat. Would you mind if I share some of these resources in my local workplace?
Absolutely. Yep. Share stuff around. The stuff that I put together usually has my name on it. So as long as you're not like purposely scrubbing it off, I appreciate you not doing that. But otherwise, go right ahead.
From the chat, someone's commenting, it's great that people have added pronouns to their signature blocks. How about business cards?
Oh yeah, for sure. You can kind of stick them anywhere, right? Stick them on business cards, email signatures. There are pins that people use. You could, like the signs that you have on your door, you could add your pronouns there. Essentially, like the more that pronouns become visible, I think the less they will be seen as the domain of trans people. Um, yeah, some folks, when I introduce pronoun stuff and pronoun checks, we're like, well, I don't use pronouns. Like, oh, my friend, yes, we all use pronouns. It's not just about trans folks. So I think the more we call attention to pronouns, right, the easier it will be also for our brains to kind of like drag them out, shove them back in. Oh, sorry about that. Yeah.
Um, have you heard about referring to mother and father by different terms, like aunt, uncle being uncle, uncle?
Uncle. Yeah. So let's see. What are the most common ones? Um, I haven't heard ones that are quite as standard as like uncle. That seems to have like taken a nice grip on stuff. Mappa. I think that was featured in like
Oh, that was in that
those TV
wonderful,
shows.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Um, let's see.
papa.
Yeah, I can't really think of any off the top of my head, mostly because my brain's never been good with
Make
details.
one
But
up.
make one up. Well, I always like Poppy, and I know that that's a Newfoundland's like pop term, but it also has like the like Poppy the flower, which
Mhm.
I don't know if I think really at the end of the day, it's like whichever one someone feels comfortable. I know a number of trans parents will use like their name, or a version of their name, like a nickname that stems from their name. Yeah.
And the final question that we have had so many positive comments and attendees saying thank you, and it's wonderful. But the final actual question, when conducting research with human participants, we often ask them to identify a gender. Is it okay to have other as an option?
Yeah. So um, others fine. You know, let's remember what other can other othering is a other can be othering, in terms of like, oh, there's like the two legitimate genders and then there's that other one. Other is better than nothing. If you have the option to write in gender stuff, that's where I find you actually get the most detail, but you also get a couple of people who are like, LOL, gender, I'm a helicopter. So might lose a bit of data that way. Um, yeah, so a blank line would probably be what I most recommend, but it's not feasible for some, especially like large scale statistical analysis, in which case you might have, instead of maybe having other, you could have a write-in spot, or yes, I guess, you can have other. It is a lesser option, but not a totally terrible one. If I could, Janet,
Yeah.
actually, because I was looking at this Canadian Forces question, and I think it's a little bit more than just the signage.
Oh,
It's actually
absolutely.
talking a little about making single-sex physical spaces safe
Okay.
for folks who don't really fit in. And if you look at especially the EGAL data, and there's a whole lot of other research around that, is that these spaces are already quite unsafe, sometimes even for cisgender straight women, but especially for queer women, for gender non-conforming assigned female at birth folks, for trans women and trans feminine people, so anyone who isn't straight and cisgender. And I think that this is where some of the deeper and more difficult conversation comes in, because there it intersects with this idea that there are bodies to protect, and that there's gender to protect, and this is, I'm not interested in throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I come from a family of single-sex schooling as well. My grandmother's the principal of the school that I went to, and I learned at the age of 6 of like all of the benefits that you get when you take a bunch of girls and school them, and how many more go into science and math and play trombone and drums and like all of the masculine things. So uh, I'd like to bring this question to the fore, specifically not to answer it, but to say that if we are adopting a protectionist philosophy, which I think is warranted given that we still live in the patriarchy and it's hard and it's important, that the bodies who need to be protected are not just women's, and that we need to come up with better ways of going about that in general. And maybe that is having like 3 different washrooms or change rooms, right? That's what the Paul Reynolds Center did. They called it the family inclusive washroom, but it's also understood that if you are going to get bullied out of both washrooms, then you can be in this one in the middle here. So yeah, not quite sure what to do with that. I'm really interested, if anyone has any background in single sex education and wants to talk gender equity, please get in touch with me, because this is probably where I'll head in the next 10 years. Yeah, other than that, I'll float that there as a nice sort of
Okay.
way to
And I
close
apologize.
without closing.
Yeah, and I apologize for not reading that question properly.
Oh,
It's
it's all
kind of,
good.
so I think there is a couple more questions in the chat, but I think what we'll do is we'll let Taylor answer those privately or individually, because we really should, unfortunately, we have to wrap up, and we could be going for hours on this. I'd like to thank Taylor so much for sharing their time and their expertise with us. And Taylor, do you have any final words that you'd like to share with the audience?
I'm just incredibly grateful that all of y'all stayed for this length of time, that you are here and enthusiastic as learners, and am always here if you need a resource. And just like, thanks so much. You've made my day by being here with me today.
That's awesome. Well, you've made our day. So everyone out there, thank you for attending and for your great questions. I'm going to echo Taylor. And if you enjoyed today's event, remember, check out our alumni website for upcoming things, including several more MUNalum 101 events in November. We're going to cover diverse topics such as social enterprise, the ins and outs of coffee, and the latest research on the importance of sleep. And don't forget to subscribe to our Memorial University alumni YouTube channel, where you can find all the other webinars that we've been doing and all the other good stuff. So lots of great stuff there. As I indicated earlier, this session has been recorded, and I will be sharing a link in an upcoming email. And that email will also include a PDF of Taylor's presentation. So I'd like to thank Taylor for that as well. Just like to say to everyone to enjoy the rest of their day. And thanks again for joining us. And thanks again, Taylor. And good luck in Ottawa and with your PhD studies, and all the best. Okay,
Thanks so much,
take care.
everyone. Have a great day.
Bye.
Thanks for all your lovely comments. I'm reading them here.